Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and I'd like to take just a second to thank you for taking a moment out of your busy lives of quarantine, which you're all definitely still doing. Right? Right? And welcome you in to a comfy, cozy Warframe video. So pull up a stool, sit by the fire. Billy, put that fire out! And let's lament about our love for Kuva! What's this? Makari making a video that's not about some abstract piece of the game or addressing an issue that's going on in Warframe? Preposterous, I tell you! But it's more likely than you think. Loki, as his name may suggest, is a cheeky sort of fella. When he's not doing his best impersonation of my fiancée when I ask her to go for a jog with me, Loki, as his name may suggest, by the mythos of what his name is based off of, he's a bit of a cheeky boy. He likes to, disappear and steal your lingerie and weapons and, well, pretty much everything in your house for that matter, and just acts all kinds of the Mickey to annoy his enemies. In all seriousness, though, when you think of Loki, you probably think of a frame that's generally used for his stealth capabilities, and that's probably about it. But what if I told you that there are actually far more uses to this frame than just being able to do your best impersonation of Leonardo DiCaprio's Oscars? Well, it's true, little Billy. Loki, although basing himself around stealth to keep himself alive, also boasts some very useful utility and crowd control functionality. One of the main assets being his Radle Disarmed, and the thing here is, this scales even without modding, and against Corpus and Grineer targets can be one of the strongest crowd controls in the game. Because let's face it, no matter what level of the enemy, if they ain't got a gun, they ain't gonna be shooting you. And although, you'll never really see Loki being used for damage, and although the age-old meta of crowd control is no longer a thing, and although, yes, some people don't like frames that don't do damage, Loki has never really lost his shine. Even to this day and age, his playstyle is still very bouncy, very enjoyable. And although he's probably one of the frames that has had the least amount of reworks done to him, if any at all, that I can recall. And because of that, Loki's maintained the stance of being a stealth frame. And because of the lack of fiddling, he feels old, but he still is very enjoyable to play. For the most part, as a Loki, you're going to be utilizing a lot of duration to lengthen the time you can spend invisible. This in turn acts as your survivability, as if the enemy can't see you, well, they're not going to shoot you, for the most part. Then adding some range, it can then give you that extra security with making sure the enemy definitely can't attack back, utilizing your Radle Disarmed. And I'm going to put this out there. His other two abilities are also incredibly useful for solo and team play and acts towards a very rewarding sensation of bouncy playstyle. With this one allowing you to make a decoy that can distract enemies or even for your team to have a low energy cost scapegoat, especially if you don't have the energy available for a stealth or a Radle Disarm. Then his 3 is a blink teleport, where you replace yourself with the location of your enemy to where you were originally. Other than also being a troll and a troll's best friend, it can then allow you to relocate yourself to a safe location, or combining this with Loki's other abilities, you'll quickly find just how bouncy and enjoyable Loki can be. Because I'm not going to lie, I never really enjoyed Loki until I got to this video. And you know what? Even though he is pretty much used for stealth and nothing but stealth at this stage, if you play him and play to his strengths, he can be incredibly useful for a team. And although the notion and meta of CC is out the window these days, being in a oh shit situation and then having a Radle Disarm that can take away all the weapons of your enemies can save a team in a situation where you may have otherwise died. Loki is obtained from killing the hyena pack on Neptune, and honestly, these little puppies don't really pose much of a threat for killing. Take some crowd control and focus down one hyena at a time. Keeping them separated will definitely help you as well. In essence, the hyena pack ain't much to deal with, and if you can separate them up and keep them crowd controlled, you shouldn't really struggle with them. The blueprint itself is obtained from the marketplace by pressing the quote-unquote blueprint tab while on the Warframe category. Then the chassis and neuroptics have a 38.72% chance of dropping, and then the systems have a 22.56% chance of dropping from the hyena pack. So those systems might require a few more runs to get. Otherwise, this is a very simple mode of acquisition for a frame, and honestly, one that can have permanent invisibility is really recommended, even if you may not get that much damage out of him. The prime variant of this frame is currently, and unfortunately usually, always vaulted, so if you're wanting to get a hold of him, you better make use of my handy dandy platinum farming guide to raise some money to buy yourself those pieces. Self-promotion aside, it is one of those frames that has general very ease of access of obtaining, whether it's the prime or the non-prime variant you're after. So, let's move on to the abilities here, my dudes. I can't believe I wrote this. In prime fashion of the older frames, their abilities and passives tend to reflect that archaic nature that the older frames sort of went by back in ye old years, where passives and abilities weren't always sought to be able to destroy half the planet with a single use. And Loki is no different. Loki's passive is, he can wall latch 10 times longer than a normal frame. Which, I mean, that's kind of cool. I mean, it does make the whole notion of doing certain ribbons a bit easy, which can be kind of nice, but really, it's not a passive you're going to get much use out of. I mean, can you honestly tell me when the last time you made use of wall latching was, other than from opening a really obnoxious ribbon? Moving on to the main abilities now, Decoy is Loki's one. I honestly wish I had this ability in real life so I could get out of having to do the dishes whenever my fiance asks, but hey, we can't all have what we want in this world. Now, Decoy is quite a simple ability, as all of Loki's abilities are. Decoy will summon your new best friend, a holographic form of yourself. I mean, who could make a better company for you than on those lonely Warframe nights than a hologram of yourself? The hologram will have 400 shields and 200 health and will last for a maximum of 25 seconds. This clone makes a great distraction to bait enemies away from your location and can serve as a multifaceted survival device if you're trying to defend a defense target and need to divert some of that attention away from the objective you're defending. On top of that as well, you can utilize it with some of your other abilities to make some getaway scenarios, if you will. The first augment, and yes, I did say first augment, just bear with me a sec. The first augment here is called Savior Decoy. Now, this is quite an interesting little augment, and kind of like how it says on the tin, essentially, the way this augment works, if you were to take fatal damage, instead of dying and getting knocked down, you will take the place of your decoy and be put into a immunity state for 5 seconds, which basically means, oh crap, if I'm gonna die, I guess my decoy may as well come with me. So would I recommend having a mod and taking away a mod spot just for a mod that gives you a second chance every minute? Possibly. Keeping in mind that Loki's builds are always very fluidical, so really, because there's not much modding required for Loki, you have a lot of room to dabble around with augments. Now, yes, I did make mention that there is another augment for Loki, and this one is called Savior Decoy. And you might be thinking, but Makari, isn't that one of the ones from Conclave? And yes, Billy, yes it is. That is because DE, in their intrepid adventure of rehashing old content that nobody uses, because let's face it, nobody plays Conclave, have rehashed the augments from Conclave to be PvE friendly. The one for Loki is called Savior Decoy, and what this now does is it diverts 50% of the damage from the clone to you, or 50% of damage from you to the clone. If you want this to use this augment in its best form, utilizing some extra mitigation with steel fiber and vitality, for example, will mean that you can have a bit of extra survivability and mitigation, although you do have to watch out, because if your clone is taking extortionate amounts of damage, diverting 50% of that damage to you could maybe cause you to fall on your ass. But again, it's an interesting little augment, and more so than anything else, this can be utilized with other mechanics to almost make yourself immortal, if you will. The second ability is called Invisibility. This ability causes you to transform into a 3-headed dragon for 45 seconds and belch out obscenities in a Welsh accent, all the while having your legs morph into squid-like tentacles and slap nearby enemies for 69 damage per tick. I'm joking. It turns you invisible for 12 seconds. I mean, this is quite literally one of the most simplistic abilities in all of Warframe. You activate it, you turn invisible to all forms of detection other than lasers. And then the duration is based off how much duration you've modded for. And as mentioned earlier, this is in essence your main form of survivability when playing Loki. Because let's face it, if the enemy can't see you, they can't shoot you. Obviously, you will have to then recast it whenever it runs out, but the second you go invisible, your enemies will start wondering where the hell you've gone and why the hell their ass has now been chopped from their body. And if to compound the whole stealth asset, the augment for this is called Hushed Invisibility. This causes your weapon to have their noise reduced by 100% for the duration of the stealth. Really? This helps to compound that whole thing of being a stealthy ninja, and could even help with augments where you don't want to be detected but still want to use your guns. Or for the like-minded people who want to use Loki for doing spy missions and not want to set off the alarms. Ah, the time where abilities didn't take 15 paragraphs to explain every detail. Those were the days. I don't know why I didn't make this guide sooner, honestly. I mean, I am feeling rather lazy at the moment, but with not having a webcam. Switch Teleport is Loki's 3. And Switch Teleport does exactly what it says on the tin. It swaps your location with a target within 75 meters. Now, this necessarily is, again, one of the most simplistic abilities in all of Warframe. But think of it this way. Utilizing this can get you out of sticky situations or help get allies out of sticky situations as well, because you can teleport yourself with allies that are downed, allowing you to get them out of a danger zone and help get them up, if you will. Or you can teleport yourself with an enemy from further away that might not be in such a precarious location where there might not be as many guns trained upon you. The augment for this ability is called Safeguard Switch. And now, first of all, let me just tell you what this does. This augment will cause the ally that you safeguard to switch with to become immortal for 6 seconds. That duration is then increased based on your duration you've modded for. So you could, in theory, make your allies immortal for upwards of 20 seconds if you're building this right. Combining this then with the augment from your 1, where you reduce damage mitigation when your ally or you are taking damage, this, in theory, could make you almost immortal. In fact, utilizing this with your augment for your 1 is actually really recommended. And again, because Loki doesn't necessarily need that heavy of a modding semantic, you can in fact fit double augments on this guy to make this work. And this, in theory, could then give you an almost immortal scapegoat. I mean, you're seeing here just how potent this is. Your decoy is very attractive. It's clearly wearing some kind of sexy lingerie of some kind that the Grineer find very attractive. And if it's immortal, well, they're never going to shoot at you. And that makes an immortal scapegoat that the enemy are always going to be shooting at. And now for the only ability in Loki's repertoire that might require a little bit of forethought when building for Loki's builds. Radle Disarmed, again, does exactly what it says on the tin. So Radle Disarmed, in short, will cause any enemy within 20 meters to take 500 impact damage, which, let's face it, isn't exactly a lot. But this is where things get interesting. We're not here to use Loki for damage. That's like using Limbo for his AoE damage. It can be done, but let's face it, it shouldn't be what's prioritized. Enemies struck by Radle Disarmed are permanently disarmed of their ranged weapon. And I say permanently. So you know those bombards that have been bugging you for so long? Yeah, they ain't looking so tough now, are they? I mean, the great thing about this ability is the fact once the enemy have been hit, that's it. You don't need to worry about those enemies becoming a threat again at a ranged perspective, at least. Yes, they will still come towards you and try and melee you, but let's face it, if you're Loki, they won't see you in the first place. If nothing else, this acts as a infinitely scaling crowd control that can make Corpus and Grineer enemies far, far less of a threat. And again, because it's permanent, you know that those enemies are likely not going to be as much of a threat from a distance anymore. Now, the augment for this is where things get a little bit weird, but also kind of fun. So this augment is called Irradiating Disarm, and merely adds an extra bit of crowd control to what you're already doing. So you can kind of act as a bit of an Allah Akbar Loki by going amidst your enemies and activating it. The radiation proc will then affect them with the radiation debuff, causing them to fight each other. So although you already have disarmed them, now they're about to start meleeing the crap out of each other, adding to that self-damage and also the crowd control. The duration of the radiation is obviously then based on your duration, and because you're building for duration a lot of the time anyway, the enemy are now going to be more of a threat to each other than they are you. And realistically speaking, if you build for a pure range crowd control Loki, this could be one of the funnest things to add to any of your builds, because watching the enemy kill each other is incredibly satisfying. And now, a quick look at Loki's builds. And it's going to be a very quick look because realistically, Loki's builds are very fluid. There's never really a wrong choice here, because you're focusing so heavily on duration. So long as you have some duration in your builds and rely on your invisibility, the world's your oyster with everything else. So, as always with these builds, the aura mod is an entirely personal preference. I could recommend Energy Siphon just to make sure you're able to cast a bit more on the fly. But realistically here, we have our duration in the form of continuity, narrow-minded, Augur Message, and Constitution. That extra bit of knockdown preference as well is quite nice. We then have Streamline, so that we can cast our abilities a bit more frequently without soaking up too much energy. And because in this build in particular, you're not going to be making as much use of your other abilities like Radle Disarmed for that, you don't necessarily need to have Flow on here, because you are just going to be relying mostly on your invisibility for your functionality. Survivability mods, again, you're going to be invisible, so you don't necessarily need survivability mods, but having that bit of a safety net is always quite nice. What I would also do here is if you plan on using an augment, the augment's best place would be in the place of one of these augments, in place of one of these survivability mods here. And again, we then have Stretch for that little bit of range, so if we do decide to use Radial Disarm or switch location with an enemy using R3, then we can do that as well. Something you'll notice with these builds is when you focus on one element, it basically gets put down to a very simplistic notion of that element. Building for duration, you get the stealth. Building for range, you get the crowd control. So the first build was the duration build for stealth. This one is now the range build for crowd control and utility. So again, we've started off with focusing on our range. So we have overextended, we have stretch, and we have Augur Reach to add to the range, and we then also have Cunning Drift as well. Honestly, you could put Rush here in place of it, but that's down to personal preference. We then have Flow. Now, Flow is kind of a need here, because with a range build, you're going to be relying on casting your 4 and probably your 3 quite frequently. So having that extra energy pool to pull from will be extremely worthwhile. And honestly, you could even go with Streamline and Fleeting Expertise here to make sure you are able to cast them much more frequently. But I find just Streamline by itself is more than enough. Using the build like this is gonna be able to allow you to have some very powerful crowd control of your 4. It will affect a huge area, disarming waves and waves of enemies. With this as well, you then have your survivability in the form of Vitality and Steel Fiber. Again, survivability mods are always personal preference. Put whatever you so choose down. But because you don't have as much duration, you're not going to be invisible as often. So you will need to make sure you have that safety net just in case you get caught out without your invisibility on. And then just the adverse of what we had on the previous build, where we had duration with a little bit of range. This time we have range with a little bit of duration. See how they're kind of like the polar opposites of each other, with two very different antitheses of utility to them. And as always, a very new player-friendly build, as admittedly there is no such thing with Loki because, well, all of his builds are incredibly simplistic from the word go, but if you want to utilize a more new player-friendly build, which requires very little in terms of effort to make work, then this will work perfectly for you. You've got your baseline mods with Flow, Stretch, Streamline, Vitality, Continuity, and Steel Fiber, giving you that survivability, the efficiency, and the range and duration you'll need. And then, of course, with all these new player builds, if there is something that's slightly harder to get, I do try and make a point of pointing it out. So with this, we have Augur Reach and Augur Message, both of which comes from Planes of Eidolon. But this entire build can be made with 0 format. In fact, all of these builds I've shown you can be made with 0 to 1 format if you're using the Prime variant. If you're using the non-Prime variant, you might need 1 or 2 format at most, especially for the more complicated builds like the range and duration build. And that's the Loki guide. One more down the pan. We've only got a couple more to go now before we completed the entire repertoire, at least until Prothea's released anyway. So, hopefully this video's been informative. I personally have actually found it very informative for myself, because these guides are often a reason why I end up playing frames more than I otherwise would have. It's one of those things, right, where you never really think you'd play a frame because it doesn't really feel like it would suit your playstyle. And then you give it a try and you suddenly realize just how fun it is. And that to me has been Loki. In fact, there's been a lot of frames recently, like Grendel, for example. But again, hopefully this video's been informative. I'm not going to go off on a tangent. If you feel like joining us, then by all means, click the Twitch link down below. We stream daily with Warframe, getting you guys involved. And if you want to come and join us, we will answer any question and we'll get you involved and do whatever we can to help your assistance within Warframe. Do feel free to drop by the Twitter as well, where I make daily updates and post art that I draw. And if you want to keep up to date with the stream, that will be a great way of doing so as well, and it'll support me a lot. So thank you very much for watching, guys, and I hope to see all of you top adders either on the stream or in the next video. Ta-ra!